The Galactic Academy of Higher Intelligence had seen students from countless worlds walk through its towering glass doors. The Academy, nestled on the serene planet of Gareve, was a beacon of peace, education, and knowledge, drawing the brightest minds from across the galaxy. Its faculty, composed mainly of the gentle and scholarly Ziril, had long been admired for their philosophy of diplomacy, negotiation, and their distaste for war. Conflict was considered primitive, a barbaric relic of less civilized species. This was the environment in which Jason Hayes, a human from Earth, a Class 12 Deathworld, was thrust. Earth had recently made its formal debut in the Galactic Union, and while humanity was still relatively new to interstellar politics, it had already gained a reputation. Earth was notorious for its chaotic ecosystems, its unpredictable weather, and, above all, its inhabitants' capacity for violence. To the peaceful races of the galaxy, humanity was both a curiosity and a potential threat. Jason knew this when he enrolled in the Academy, but he hadn't come to cause trouble. He had been selected by the Earth Space Coalition to represent humanity at the Academy, a move designed to foster peaceful relations. Jason, however, was not a scholar or diplomat by nature. He was a soldier, a lieutenant commander in Earth's Space Command. He had seen combat, blood, and death, and though he didn't relish violence, he understood its necessity in ways these peaceful alien species could never comprehend. From the moment he arrived, Jason stood out, at over 6 feet tall, with a muscular build honed from years of physical training. He towered over many of his fellow students. His skin was scarred from previous battles, and his sharp blue eyes exuded a steely determination. Most of the other students hailed from peaceful worlds, where violence was either rare or non-existent. They were fascinated by the human, and while some were eager to learn about Earth's brutal history, others kept their distance, intimidated by his presence. The Ziril instructors, known for their calm and composed nature, had mixed feelings about their new student. On the one hand, they were curious to learn about this Deathworlder, but on the other hand, they feared what his perspective on violence might bring to their peaceful institution. Professor Kelvex, a highly regarded Ziril who had been teaching galactic strategy for over 3 centuries, was particularly concerned. Kelvex had devoted his life to teaching peaceful conflict resolution, diplomatic strategies, and the art of negotiation. To him, war was the ultimate failure of intelligence. He knew of Earth's violent history and its species' penchant for conflict, but he believed that even humans could be taught the value of peace. Jason's first day at the Academy was uneventful. He listened to lectures on diplomacy, participated in discussions on trade negotiations, and attended classes on interspecies relations. He sat quietly in the back of the room, observing more than speaking, but despite his silence, Jason couldn't help but feel that something was missing. These aliens, with their long histories of peace and harmony, had no idea what real conflict was. They believed in words and treaties, but Jason had seen firsthand how easily words could break down in the face of raw power. It wasn't long before Jason's quiet presence became a source of intrigue among the students and faculty. The aliens, many of whom came from worlds with no concept of war, had never encountered a Deathworlder like Jason before. They whispered in the hallways about Earth's violent history, about its wars, its weapons, and its capacity for destruction. Some students were terrified of him, while others viewed him as a novelty. Despite the whispers, Jason tried to keep his head down. He wasn't here to start trouble. But the turning point came during Galactic Strategy 101, one of the Academy's most prestigious courses. The lecture that day was on resolving interstellar disputes through non-violent means, and Professor Kelvex stood at the front of the room, his 4 long fingers steepled as he began to outline a recent case study. Class, today we will discuss the Verushan-Kora dispute, a conflict between 2 neighboring star systems. As you know, the Verushans sought to expand their mining operations into Kora space. Negotiations broke down, and tensions rose, but through careful mediation, both parties eventually reached an agreement. Jason listened with a growing sense of frustration. The situation was clear to him. The Verushans had wanted something the Kora possessed, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Yet the professor seemed to treat it as a diplomatic victory. Kelvex continued, as you can see, with the right diplomatic tools, even the most dangerous of situations can be defused. Now, I'd like you all to consider alternative methods of resolving such disputes. What could have been done differently to avoid even the appearance of conflict? Jason raised his hand. Kelvex, and used to having his methods questioned. blinked in surprise before acknowledging the human. With respect, Professor, this wasn't a success, Jason said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. The Varusians were testing the chorus limits. They wanted to see how far they could push. If the Chora hadn't agreed to negotiate, the Varusians would have taken what they wanted by force. The negotiation didn't prevent conflict, it just delayed it. The room was silent. Many of the students stared at Jason, unsure how to respond. Kelvex's calm expression faltered for a moment before he replied. Mr. Hayes, I understand that your world may have a different approach to conflict resolution, but here at the Academy, we believe in the power of peaceful negotiation. Violence is the last resort of the incompetent. Jason's jaw tightened. That might work for you, but not everyone plays by the same rules. On Earth, we have a saying, speak softly, but carry a big stick. Diplomacy is important, but you have to be ready to defend yourself when negotiations fail. Kelvex's eyes widened, and several students gasped. The idea of preparing for violence was anathema to everything the Academy stood for. Kelvex quickly regained his composure and responded, perhaps on your world, such measures are necessary, but we have evolved beyond the need for conflict. You will find that in most of the galaxy, violence only leads to destruction. Jason's frustration boiled over. He wasn't trying to provoke a debate, but the idea that these aliens believed conflict could always be avoided was absurd. He had seen what happened when you weren't prepared for war, you lost everything. In the days following the confrontation, the atmosphere around Jason shifted. The other students kept their distance, some viewing him as dangerous, others merely confused by his perspective. But the more Jason observed, the more he realized how unprepared these aliens were for the harsh realities of the galaxy. Most of them came from peaceful, idyllic worlds, where war had been relegated to history books. They couldn't fathom the concept of a species that lived with violence as a constant threat. It wasn't long before Jason's views came to a head. During another lecture on conflict resolution, Kelvex presented a scenario in which two rival species were on the brink of war over disputed territory. The professor asked the students to brainstorm peaceful solutions, suggesting trade agreements, shared governance, and joint resource management. Jason remained silent at first, but as the discussion continued, he couldn't hold back any longer. He stood up, addressing the class. This is pointless. You're assuming both sides are interested in peace. What if one side wants to take the territory by force? What then? Kelvex frowned. Mr. Hayes, we believe in the power of reason and compromise. There is always a solution that avoids violence. Jason shook his head. Not always. Sometimes, the only way to survive is to fight. The class fell silent, and Kelvex's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that violence is a viable solution, Mr. Hayes? I'm suggesting you need to be prepared for it, Jason replied. Let me show you. Without waiting for permission, Jason walked to the front of the room and motioned for two students to join him. One was a slender avian, with delicate wings folded against her back. The other was a towering Varnak, a reptilian species known for their strength but not for their combat skills. You're the avian, and you're trying to defend your territory, Jason said, pointing to the avian student. You, Varnak, are trying to take it. Diplomacy has failed. Now what? The students exchanged nervous glances. Unsure of what to do, Jason stepped between them, picking up a metal chair from the side of the room. This is your weapon, he said, holding it up. It's not ideal, but it'll do. Now, show me how you'd defend yourself. The avian hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Jason's eyes hardened. That's the problem. You're not ready for this. When the fight comes, you won't have time to think, you'll have to act. He demonstrated a basic combat stance, swinging the chair in a defensive arc. Even if you don't have a weapon, you can use your environment. You can't assume the enemy will fight fair. The other students watched in stunned silence. To them, this was unthinkable. Using violence, even in a controlled environment, was something they had never considered. But Jason knew better. He knew that conflict didn't care about their ideals. He had seen friends die because they weren't prepared, and he wasn't about to let these students fall into the same trap. Kelvex, horrified by what he was witnessing, finally stepped forward. Mr. Hayes, this is highly inappropriate. We do not train for war here. Jason turned to face the professor, his expression resolute. You should. Word of Jason's impromptu combat lesson spread quickly through the academy. Some of the students were outraged, while others were intrigued. Jason's views had sparked a debate among the faculty, many of whom believed that his teachings were dangerous and contradicted the Academy's mission of peace. But a small minority began to wonder if Jason had a point. The galaxy was vast, and not every species shared the Zeral's peaceful philosophy. Perhaps it was time to consider what would happen if the Academy's ideals were tested by a species that did not value peace. The conflict came sooner than anyone expected. Several weeks after the incident, a new species made contact with the Academy, the Kothar, a warlike race known for their expansionist ambitions. The Kothar had little interest in diplomacy. They viewed the Academy's peaceful teachings as a sign of weakness and saw an opportunity to expand their territory by subjugating the planet of Gareve. The Academy's leaders, confident in their diplomatic skills, arranged a meeting with the Kothar's representatives, hoping to avoid conflict. Jason, having learned of the meeting, warned them not to underestimate the Kothar's intentions. "They're not here to negotiate," Jason told Professor Kelvex in private. "They're here to take what they want. If you don't stand up to them, they'll walk all over you." Kelvex, though uncomfortable with Jason's bluntness, dismissed the warning. "We have faced aggressive species before, Mr. Hayes. Diplomacy will prevail." But when the Kothar arrived, it quickly became clear that they had no interest in peaceful discussions. Their leader, a towering, armored figure named Zorak, made it clear that Gareve would either submit to Kothar rule or be destroyed. The Academy's leaders, unprepared for such an ultimatum, were left scrambling for a response. Kelvex, shocked by the Kothar's aggression, found himself at a loss for words. It was Jason who stepped forward, addressing Zorak directly. "You want this planet?" Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "Then you'll have to go through me." The Kothar soldiers, amused by the humans' defiance, laughed. Zorak, however, saw something in Jason's eyes that gave him pause. He had heard of Deathworlders before, species that survived in the most hostile environments, where death was a constant threat. He knew that humans were different from the other peaceful species at the Academy. Zorak smiled, baring sharp teeth. "Very well, Deathworlder, let's see what you're made of." The Academy, having never prepared for war, was caught completely off guard by the Kothar's attack. The Kothar ships descended on Gareve like a swarm, and within hours, the once peaceful planet was under siege. The Zeral, having never fought a war, were unable to mount an effective defense, but Jason, along with a small group of students who had secretly been training under his guidance, was ready. Using the Academy's limited resources, Jason and his team quickly organized a makeshift defense. They set up barricades, improvised weapons, and coordinated ambushes. The Kothar, expecting an easy victory, were surprised to find resistance. The humans and their allies fought with a ferocity that the Kothar had never encountered at the Academy. Jason led the charge, using the combat techniques he had taught in secret to outmaneuver the Kothar soldiers. His team, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperation born of survival. They knew that failure meant the end of the Academy and likely the enslavement of its inhabitants. In the midst of the chaos, Jason confronted Zorak in a one-on-one battle. The Kothar leader, confident in his strength, attacked with brutal force. But Jason, having fought on the battlefields of Earth, knew how to exploit his opponent's overconfidence. He dodged Zorak's attacks, using his agility and speed to wear the alien down. In a final, decisive move, Jason disarmed Zorak and held him at gunpoint. "This ends now," Jason said, his voice cold. Zorak, though beaten, smiled. "You fight well, Deathworlder, but this is only the beginning. Your kind will never know peace." Jason narrowed his eyes. "Maybe not, but we'll fight for it anyway." With Zorak defeated, the Kothar forces retreated, unwilling to continue the battle without their leader. The Academy, though damaged, had survived. The students and faculty, many of whom had been sheltered from the realities of war, now understood the importance of being prepared for conflict. In the aftermath of the Kothar attack, the Galactic Academy was forever changed. The Zeral, once adamant in their belief that diplomacy could solve all problems, had come to realize that the galaxy was far more dangerous than they had thought. Peace was a noble goal, but without the means to defend it, it was fragile. Professor Kelvex, humbled by the experience, approached Jason after the battle. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice filled with uncharacteristic uncertainty, "perhaps we have been too quick to dismiss your perspective. It seems we have much to learn." Jason, still bloodied from the fight, nodded. There's always a place for peace, Professor, but sometimes, you have to fight for it. The Academy, once a beacon of peace, now incorporated combat training into its curriculum not to glorify violence, but to ensure that its students were prepared for the harsh realities of the galaxy. Jason continued to teach, not just about war, but about survival, resilience, and the balance between peace and strength. And while the Zero remained committed to their ideals, they could no longer deny the lessons of the Deathworlder who had turned their classroom into a training ground for survival.